The room holds its breath. For a moment the past seems to pulse beneath the dust, as if the air remembers a night no one wanted to speak of. Darkness stains the corners of the old storage unit, a forgotten municipal evidence room tucked behind the parish courthouse, abandoned except for the dim strip of emergency light flickering across metal shelves. Time feels still here, quiet, unmoving, yet something unsettled lingers, like a faint vibration under the floor. This is where the file waited. This is where her story rested. Her name was Elara Duvall, age 27, born outside Shreveport, raised along the slow curve of the Red River. A woman with a voice soft enough to calm the restless kids she taught at the local elementary school, someone with small ambitions and a quiet presence. She disappeared on an October night in 1986, last seen locking the door of her small rental house before the storm rolled in. The next morning she was found in a stretch of overgrown marshland. Her life ended in a way no one understood. The case stalled in months, then froze for decades. Now in the stale air of this forgotten room, investigator Marshland Hayes steps inside again, as if pulled by the weight of something unfinished. His movements are slow, deliberate. He doesn't speak. He barely breathes. He carries the silence like an old coat. The light falls across a cardboard box with her name written in faded ink. Inside it, he knows, is the phantom of a night unresolved, photographs, partial reports, fragments that never fit. He approaches the box not like an investigator but like someone visiting a grave. A soft creak from the shelves echoes behind him. The dust shifts, and for the first time in decades the case stirs. The suspense is quiet, clinical, and alive again. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. Hayes doesn't lift the lid immediately. He lets his hand rest on the softened cardboard, feeling the brittle edge under his palm. It is a small ritual, one he has followed in every cold case he has ever reopened. A way of acknowledging the life inside the paperwork, the person reduced to ink and faded photographs. The room is heavy with dust, and when he finally lifts the lid, a faint scatter of it floats upward, illuminated in the weak beam of the ceiling light, drifting like unsettled memory. Inside the box, everything has shifted slightly from age. A sealed envelope, 2 cassette tapes, a handful of weather-worn evidence markers, and a stack of photographs curled at the edges. But these are not what brought him back. He came for something new. 2 days earlier, while inventorying old evidence for digital archiving, a technician flagged a small sealed item never processed, an object misplaced, unnoticed, and now rediscovered through routine scanning. It was found behind a row of mislabeled boxes, concealed in a gap between the shelf and the wall. A plastic sleeve containing a single item, a button. But not just any button. A metallic one, engraved with a tiny geometric pattern on the edge, unusual for clothing in 1986, and even more unusual for anyone in rural Louisiana to wear. Its discovery immediately triggered reassessment protocols. The case, dormant for nearly 40 years, was reopened. Hayes places the box on the metal table in the center of the room. He doesn't sit. Instead, he stands as he begins cataloging the old contents again. The stale smell of aging paper mixes with the faint metallic scent of the building's old pipes. On the table beside the box, he sets the newly discovered sleeve. The button glints softly under the light. It is small, unassuming, almost forgettable, yet he feels the weight of it in the air, a presence, a disturbance. Something logical, grounded, undeniable. Nothing supernatural, nothing grand. Just a simple physical object that should not have been missing, should not have been found 24 feet from where the rest of the evidence was stored. He leans over the table, hands on either side, and studies the button through the plastic. The pattern is faint, 6 lines intersecting in a minimalist star shape, almost invisible unless the light hits at an angle. He tries to recall if any of the individuals interviewed decades ago wore something like this. No images surface. Only fragmented recollections. A neighbor describing hearing a car door, a colleague mentioning Elara's unfinished lesson plans, a passerby who saw headlights where there shouldn't have been any. Hayes straightens slowly. He knows what this means. Discovery of a new physical item, especially one potentially tied to the perpetrator, forces the entire evidence chain to be re-examined. And even more importantly, the new digital scanning performed on the sleeve revealed faint residue on the button's underside. Material preserved by accident, protected by the sealed plastic all these years. He recorded the technician's voice, hesitant, almost whispering. It's possibly skin, very old but intact enough for modern analysis. That was enough. Now he stands in the dim room, holding the case like a fragile branch of memory. The button isn't loud. It doesn't scream revelation. Instead, it hums quietly with possibility, with logic, with the simple fact that someone once wore it and stood close enough to Elara for it to fall off. He picks up the old case file binder. Its spine creaks. Inside are decades-old police statements typed on now-yellowed paper, their edges curled from humidity. He flips past the familiar pages, past the locations, timestamps, scene photographs. They unfold like a muted echo of everything he once believed he understood. The new evidence demands one thing. He must return to the beginning. As he turns to the earliest report, his fingers pause. A faint indentation, barely perceptible, runs across the top of the first page as though something sharp once pressed against it. His brow tightens. He angles the page beneath the light. The indentation forms a delicate curve, too smooth to be accidental. A binder clip, no. Something circular. He glances at the button again. A quiet breath escapes him. Not shock, not fear, but the low hum of logic aligning. The indentation matches the diameter of the newly found button almost perfectly. It had been pressed there once long ago, before the sleeve was sealed. Meaning it had been handled during the initial phase of investigation. Meaning someone had touched it, noted it, and then it vanished. Not lost. Moved. His pulse steadies. The silence in the room grows denser, heavier, like the air around him recognizes a shift in direction. The case is open again, not because time demands it, but because something small, lightweight, metallic, easily overlooked, has waited patiently to speak. And finally, he is listening. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. Hayes sits now. Not comfortably. There is no comfort in returning to a case that once slipped through his hands, but with a posture shaped by discipline, by the need for precision. The metal chair groans softly under him, the sound cutting through the quiet. He places the binder flat on the table. Around him, the dust settles the way snow settles on a long-abandoned road. He begins with the timeline. October 12, 1986. Elara leaves her evening class, logs her departure time, heads home through light rain. A neighbor sees her porch light turn on. 30 minutes later, a single unfamiliar vehicle sound echoes on the gravel. After that, nothing. Hayes traces each entry with the edge of his thumbnail, reading slowly, methodically. He doesn't skim. Each sentence is its own quiet corridor he must walk through again. The past reports feel both close and distant, like faint radio static carrying an old conversation he once memorized. He pauses on a line he has underlined years ago. Victim found with signs of struggle near marsh edge. No personal belongings missing. He lifts the photograph corresponding to that note. It is cracked near the corner. The colors have faded into muted tones of mud, grass, and her stillness. He exhales through his nose, controlled, measured. Setting the photo aside, he flips to the section detailing collected items. Clothing fibers, soil samples, a torn segment of fabric from her sleeve. A simple list. Clean, organized, too organized. The button is not there. It never was. He moves deeper into the file, through old witness statements. Their voices return in fragmented murmurs. Maybe heard something, can't be sure. Saw headlights facing the water. She never mentioned anyone troubling her. Minimal, hesitant, true to the time. Rural communities often spoke like that around tragedy, a kind of careful quiet, as if words themselves might spread harm. Hayes lifts another page. This one bothers him. A brief note from the first responding officer. Small metallic object near footprint impression, not retrieved due to poor visibility. Return recommended. There is no follow-up. He flips pages quickly, then slower, searching for any indication that the officer returned. Nothing. No retrieval log, no notation, no evidence list update. It simply ended there like an abandoned sentence. The oversight isn't dramatic. It isn't cinematic. It's human. A simple lapse during a stormy night, an object overlooked in mud, recorded but not recovered. Yet that object, very likely the button, resurfaced 39 years later. Hayes rubs his thumb along the edge of the page. The weight of his earlier years, the mistakes of youth in law enforcement, hang around him like a shadow. The guilt is not dramatic. It is quiet, restrained, an internal shift he feels more than expresses. He returns to the photographs, the marsh, the impression of a boot print partially filled with water, the bend of reeds, the faint smear along a stone. He studies the angles, the composition, the details captured unconsciously by the camera lens. Then he sees it. Near the lower right corner of one photograph, barely visible, a small, circular indentation in the mud. Not sharp enough to be a footprint, not random enough to ignore. He leans in, narrowing his eyes. The size is consistent with the button. His breath steadies again. He lifts the photograph gently, as though afraid of disturbing the frozen scene within it. He angles it under the light. The indentation becomes more defined. Traces of it appear in two consecutive photos, different angles. Meaning the photographer saw it. Meaning someone photographed it intentionally. Meaning it should have been retrieved. He feels the shift inside him, not a dramatic one, but the subtle tilt of logic falling into place. Something overlooked, something silent, something that waited in the mud for decades. The details speak slowly, but they speak. He continues scanning the reports. A map of the area, a marking misaligned with the actual location indicated in the initial sketch. A statement from Elara's colleague mentioning she was planning a project with someone, though the name wasn't recorded. A neighbor's note about a visitor weeks prior whose description didn't match any known acquaintances. Details small enough to be dismissed in the noise of early investigation. Details that now feel heavier. Hayes closes the binder for a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle. He inhales the musty scent of aged paper. Something in the room shifts, not physically, but internally. He knows this case won't break open with loud revelations. It will open slowly, precisely, piece by piece. Like a button rolling out of the dark. Hayes closes the binder with a muted thud, the sound dull in the stillness. He stands, stretches the stiffness from his shoulders, and moves toward the evidence table. The newly recovered button lies under the flickering light, faintly gleaming through the sealed sleeve. Its presence feels almost like a quiet witness, small, unblinking, patient. To move forward, he must reconstruct not just the timeline, but the people orbiting Elara's life before the night she vanished. He retrieves the old suspect list, thin, tentative, shaped more by proximity than evidence. Back then, the investigation cast a wide but shallow net. Rural cases often did. Now, with decades gone, motive and alibi must be reconsidered through a different lens, clarity rather than urgency. He reads the first name. 1. Daniel Cree. Elara's landlord, age 45 at the time, lived 2 houses down from her rental property, maintained a reputation for being reliable but distant. He was the first to report seeing her porch light remain on late, though he claimed he assumed she had fallen asleep during the storm. His alibi placed him at home repairing a broken generator. No witnesses. His statement was brief, slightly distracted, as though he had more pressing matters than contributing to a police interview. Hayes remembers Daniel's tone on the old cassette tape, flat, unhurried, edges of hesitation that might have meant nothing. He replays it in his mind now, recalling the soft hiss of analog recording. Didn't hear anything unusual, storm covered most sound. Minimal, neutral, too neutral maybe. But Daniel wore practical clothing, flannel, worn denim, heavy boots. No metallic embellishments, no geometric patterns. Hayes sets Daniel's file aside. To Marisol, a colleague from the school where Elara taught. She and Elara planned lessons together, shared lunch breaks, and walked to the parking lot after work. Their relationship was professional but warm. Marin described Elara as gentle. On the night of the disappearance, Marin had left the school earlier for a family event. Her relatives confirmed her arrival, an airtight alibi. Yet her interview hinted at something slightly unresolved. She mentioned Elara had been stressed, not by work, but by something else. When asked to elaborate, her voice faltered. She didn't say, just seemed distracted. Nothing more, no detail, silence formed the rest. Hayes taps the edge of the folder. Stress could mean anything or nothing. But Marin had no known conflicts with Elara, no reason to harm her. Still, emotional proximity is a factor. He moves on. 3. Jonah Red. Mechanic. Lived near the Marshland where the body was found. A man with a reputation for working late hours, often seen driving unfamiliar vehicles for repair testing. He claimed he had been fixing a client's truck the night of the storm, and neighbors confirmed the sound of his tools. His proximity to the site, however, kept suspicion on him for weeks. Hayes reviews the notes. Subject cooperative, provided details of vehicle work and timeline, no inconsistencies. Still, Jonah's clothing, a mixture of oil-stained overalls and generic work jackets, did not match the presence of a high-quality metallic button. Hayes keeps the file open beside him. 4. Callan Ward. This name sits differently on the page. Elara's former tutor from years before, visiting town briefly during the month she died. He had reconnected with her at a local library reading event. Their interaction was noted as friendly but reserved. He left town 2 days before the discovery of her body. His alibi, driving back to Mississippi overnight. But his interview revealed a subtle shift, an undertone of something unresolved. His statement included halting pauses. She looked tired, said she'd been thinking about changing things, didn't explain what things. He wore tailored clothing, pressed shirts, neat jackets, polished shoes. More important, he liked accessories. The old photos show him wearing vests with distinct buttons. Not the same pattern, but similar in design philosophy, geometric, clean. Hayes lingers on this. Callan had never been seriously considered due to leaving town before her disappearance, but the timeline was reconstructed based on vague estimations of his departure. No receipts, no witnesses at the motel, only his word. The silence between interview lines feels heavier now. 5. Unknown visitor. A neighbor had mentioned in passing a visitor arriving at Elara's home days before her death. The description was vague: slim build, quiet posture, dark clothing, no identifiable features. The visit lasted 15 minutes. Elara never mentioned it afterward. The visitor was never identified. At the time, this lead was deprioritized. No vehicle description, no time stamp, no follow-up. In retrospect, the absence feels sharper than the presence ever did. Hayes reopens the details. Visitor wore dark coat. No symbols or patches visible. No further information. No symbols. But the button in evidence was engraved, subtle enough to be unseen unless examined closely. He looks again at the sleeve holding it. The pattern is nearly invisible unless the light tilts. The visitor could have worn such a coat without the neighbor noticing the tiny geometric star along the cuff. The silence of that tiny design is louder now. Hayes lays out all the files: Daniel, Marin, Jonah, Callan, unknown visitor, spreading them like a series of small, muted doorways. Each one opens into a possibility. Each carries motive or lack of motive, shaped by proximity, routine, sentiment, or mere coincidence. But the button is the constant, the one fragment linking backward, quietly, logically. He circles each suspect slowly in his mind. No dramatics, no leaps, only logic step by step, like placing stones in a line across a shallow river. And yet something is off. A detail presses at the edge of memory, faint but persistent. Hayes stands again, packing in slow, deliberate lines across the dusty floor. He remembers the old interview room, the fluorescent buzz, the smell of damp jackets. He remembers something else, an odd discrepancy he dismissed decades ago because it felt too small, too unimportant. A small item someone refused to place on the table during questioning. A gesture. A pocketed hand. Not threatening, not suspicious, just withheld. The memory is quiet but weighty. He returns to the files. The suspects remain lined before him like figures standing in distant fog, each close enough to observe, none close enough to claim certainty. But the fog is thinning, and somewhere behind it, one shape is becoming clearer. Clues emerge slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. Hayes begins the deeper review, this time not with broad strokes but granular inspection, cross-checking statements with timestamps, comparing witness accounts, aligning physical evidence with social patterns. This is where cold cases breathe again, not through revelation but repetition. He starts with Marin's soul. Her comment about Elara being stressed had always bothered him, but he lacked context. Now, rereading the notes, he sees something softened into the margins. Marin mentions Elara received a letter earlier that week. No letter found in the house, no follow-up question recorded, no copy, no description. Hayes turns his attention to the inventory list. No letter logged. A gap, simple, quiet, and easy to overlook. He shifts to Daniel Cree's statement. His tone on the tape had been too flat, too practiced. Hayes remembers feeling irritation back then, believing Daniel simply wanted the conversation over. But now, reading the transcript, a different detail stands out. He claimed he went to check the generator around 8:15 p.m. But the storm didn't intensify until nearly 9:00. Why perform repairs before the weather required it? Not definitive, but curious. Then Jonah read. His timeline matches weather reports, noise logged by neighbors, and the known duration of his repair work. Clear. But when Hayes studies the registered vehicles he serviced that month, he notices something. One belonged to Callan Ward. A link thin but real. Hayes returns to Callan's file. Callan visited town for a week. He borrowed a client's vehicle after experiencing engine trouble. That client was Jonah. Jonah confirmed the repair took place, but he never mentioned Callan by name in interviews, only referred to the owner indirectly. Callan claimed he left town the night before Elara disappeared. Jonah's repair log for the borrowed vehicle was dated the same day, afternoon entry, but the pickup time was missing. A small inconsistency. Hayes leans back, letting the logic settle. The pieces are not forming a full picture yet, but they are shifting into early alignment, like shadows changing with the turn of a faint light. He returns to the unknown visitor note. The description, slim, quiet, dark coat, fits too many men to narrow down, but the absence of visible details on the coat stands out now as a clue rather than trivial observation. The geometric pattern on the button is subtle. A neighbor glancing from a distance would not notice it. Hayes studies the photograph again. The indentation in the mud, rounded edges, slight angular markings. He compares it with the button. A near match. The visitor was not random, not a passerby, someone familiar enough to approach the house, someone with reason to conceal the encounter. He turns back to Callan's file, reading the lines slowly, letting the tone of the interview seep into memory. Callan's pauses. His withheld explanations. His careful phrasing about Elara changing things. What things? The letter Marin mentioned. The visitor no one identified. The misplaced button. All small details, all softly linked. Hayes feels his pulse slow into a steady investigative rhythm, the kind worn into him by repetition and regret. He moves with the precision of someone rebuilding a structure beam by beam. When he returns to the new evidence envelope, he lifts it again, letting the button catch the dim glow. A tiny geometric star. Slight scratches, where patterns suggesting frequent handling as though it belonged to a favorite item of clothing, something worn often, not occasional. He searches the files. Photographs of Callan from 1986, 3 grainy shots taken during the interview. In one, Hayes notices something subtle, the cuff of Callan's coat partly obscured by his hand. A faint shape near the edge, not identifiable but suggestive. Hayes feels a quiet shift in the air, as though the room is acknowledging the alignment. But he doesn't leap. He returns to Daniel, to Jonah, to Marin, to the visitor, to the minutiae. He maps the timeline minute by minute. He marks each suspect's location, alibi strength, emotional connection. And then he sees it, the first undeniable thread. Callan was the only one connected to both Elara and Jonah. He was the only one whose timeline had gaps. The only one who wore geometric buttoned clothing. The only one mentioned by none of the neighbors, yet remembered by Elara's colleague as someone causing her stress, indirectly. But the conflict wasn't loud. Not dramatic. It was emotional, quiet, internal, unspoken. Hayes leans forward, hands clasped loosely, gaze fixed on the pattern emerging like a slow, inevitable tide. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. Night settles through the courthouse windows. The evidence room dims further, shadows lengthening across the metal shelves. Hayes remains seated, the files arranged around him in a quiet geometry of their own. He studies each name again, slowly, methodically. Daniel, practical, distant, uninvolved beyond proximity. Marin, emotionally connected, but with no motive and no opportunity. Jonah, present geographically, but consistent in statements and logs. Callan, logical suspect, yes, but too obvious now with the button in hand. Hayes pauses. Too obvious. And that is what finally disturbs him. He returns to the small indentation on the first page of the old file, the one he believed matched the button. The curvature was right, the diameter aligned, but the pressure pattern, subtle, asymmetrical, as though the object pressed against the binder was not a button alone but attached to something else. Something flat. Something metallic. He reaches for the button again, examines the backside. Single post, centered. It wouldn't leave that asymmetrical pattern, too uniform. He turns back to the page. The indentation curves, yes, but has a second faint arc beside it, like two circles slightly offset. Not one. Two. Hayes feels a quiet realization settle in his chest. A button is singular, but an object with paired metal pieces, something clipped, something like. He stops. He reopens Daniel Cree's old file. There, in a grainy photograph taken on his porch in 1986, Daniel wears a heavy coat, frayed, utilitarian. At the collar, just visible, is a fastener, a clasp with two metal rims, side by side, engraved faintly with geometric lines. Not decorative, functional. Nearly invisible unless closely examined. Hayes' breath stills. He flips to the original evidence notes. The responding officer mentioned a small metallic object near footprint impression. Not a button. Just metallic. Daniel lived closest. Daniel reported seeing the porch light late. Daniel had no witnesses for his generator repair. Daniel's tone was flat, not neutral but practiced. The indentation on the page wasn't from the newly found button. It was from Daniel's coat clasp. Not a coincidence. Not dramatic. Logical. Quietly devastating. Hayes sits back, hands resting flat on the table, the air pressing in around him. Every detail clicks into place without force. Daniel's proximity, his opportunity, his silent demeanor, his access to the property, his unchallenged timeline. The least suspected, not because he lacked motive, but because he lacked presence. He blended into the landscape, ordinary, stable, invisible in familiarity. Hayes closes his eyes briefly. When he opens them, the room feels heavier. The truth is not loud. It never was. It waited, patient, inside a minor indentation on an aging report. The past exhales, faint and cold. Hayes leaves the evidence room only when the first hint of morning slips across the courthouse windows. The dawn light doesn't feel warm. It feels observational, pale and detached, like an impartial witness waiting for the next movement of the investigation. He carries the files under one arm, the sealed button sleeve in his hand. The hallway outside is empty, footsteps sounding too loud, too defined in the still air. He moves into his office slowly, sets the materials on the desk, and stands for several moments without touching anything. His body feels anchored by the weight of understanding. Not relief, not closure, a kind of quiet gravity, settled and inescapable. The truth has shape now. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just shaped by logic, aligned by small things, indentations, overlooked notes, faint patterns, the elements that never shout. He lowers himself into the chair. It groans under him as if waking reluctantly. He opens Daniel Cree's file and lays the photograph flat. The old image, grainy from age, shows Daniel on his porch, head turned slightly, expression unreadable. The coat he wore hangs heavily from his shoulders. The clasp at the collar, hardly noticeable back then, now gleams faintly under the new morning light. 2 metal circles. Twin arcs. A faint engraving. Hayes studies them until they stabilize into clarity. He retrieves the page from the initial binder, the one with the gentle indentation. He overlays the clasp photograph beside it. The arcs match. Not perfectly, time has a way of softening edges, but the alignment is consistent. These shapes belong to the same object. Not the button. Not an accidental match. This was the object pressed against the report decades ago. Meaning the clasp, broken or loosened, could have dropped apart. Meaning Daniel was at the marsh that night. Meaning he was far more involved than his calm tone and short sentences ever revealed. But motive remains faint. No anger, no known conflict, no documented dispute. The violence didn't originate from rage. It came from something quieter, something simmering in the spaces people rarely examine. Hayes turns to the back pages of the file. Financial notes. Property disputes. Tenant complaints. A history of small, accumulating tensions, always resolved quickly but never comfortably. Nothing explosive, everything minor, like a series of quiet pressures building in mud, never breaking the surface. He flips again to Elara's records. A note from months before. Reported faulty lock on back door. Landlord scheduled repair. But there was no confirmation of the repair being done, and the neighbor mentioned seeing Daniel near the property later that same week, not as a visit, but passing by slowly. Not enough to accuse. Enough to reconsider everything. Hayes exhaled, slow and controlled. He replays Daniel's voice from memory, the flatness, the neutrality. Not a man hiding fear, but a man holding on to silence the way others might grip a worn tool. A silence that wasn't guilt necessarily, more like an instinct, a habit. The past settled into its own shape now. Hayes reopens the section describing the footprint impressions found near the marsh. The print was shallow, distorted by water and dismissed as inconclusive. But the note also mentioned the approximate shoe size, a detail ignored because many men in the parish wore similar sizes. Yet Daniel's work boots, noted in his employment file, matched that size exactly. Another small thing. Another silent alignment. Hayes begins writing, not quickly, carefully, with precision. His pen moves in short, deliberate strokes. He documents the rediscovered evidence, the indentation pattern, the clasp correlation, the interview discrepancies, the timeline inconsistencies. Each point is factual, grounded. No speculation, no embellishment. The truth emerging from these pages is not sharp. It is subtle. It doesn't cut. It absorbs. Midway through writing, he stops, lifts his head. The office faintly hums, the air vents, the distant clatter of someone moving down the hall, the soft rustle of leaves outside the window. Morning is arriving in slow fragments. He leans back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw. There is something about this case that refuses to fit a clean moral frame. The perpetrator is not a shadowed monster, not a stranger, not someone driven by dramatic fury. Daniel Cree existed in the periphery, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. He was the kind of individual investigators tend to dismiss first because ordinariness feels like proof of harmlessness. Elara, too, lived a quiet existence, gentle, steady, present only in the soft way people remembered her. There were no grand secrets hidden in her past, no major conflicts, no dramatic confrontations. Life wasn't building toward a tragic arc. It simply slipped. Hayes doesn't like that truth. But truth doesn't ask for approval. He finishes the written summary, sets the pen down, and lets the silence settle again. When he stands, the stiffness in his body protests. He moves to the evidence table again, picks up the button sleeve. The metallic object looks almost weightless, like something a gust of wind could move. But the role it played was significant. Not because it belonged to the culprit. Ironically, it didn't. But because it redirected attention toward a forgotten indentation, which redirected attention toward a clasp, which redirected attention toward a man who had avoided scrutiny simply by existing quietly. A small misinterpretation led to a correct conclusion. A mistake that revealed the truth. Logic, not coincidence. Cause, not luck. Hayes places the sleeve down gently. Next, he retrieves the photograph of the marsh, the first crime scene image ever taken. Rain had blurred parts of it. The grass bowed. The muddy water reflected the flash of the camera. Elara's form, blurred by decades of faded pigment, remains motionless in the still moment where the shutter froze her place in time. Hayes closes his eyes, letting the scene wash over him with muted gravity. He feels, not overwhelm, not sorrow, just a quiet acknowledgement of a life that deserved more than a cold, unfinished file in a forgotten room. He whispers nothing. Silence feels more appropriate. He sits again and begins typing the formal report, adding each observation carefully. The report will not resurrect her. It will not erase the decades of unanswered questions. It will not produce catharsis. Justice, in cases like these, is procedural, not emotional, a mechanism, a sequence of steps. He writes, probable conclusion. Daniel Cree responsible based on compiled evidence, timeline reconstruction, and physical pattern correlation. No dramatic accusations. No accusations of malice. Just a statement of alignment. He stops typing, stares at the blinking cursor. Truth, he knows, doesn't always settle cleanly. It can arrive quietly, shaped by small details, slipping into the open without ceremony. Sometimes it feels incomplete even when it's clear. Sometimes it feels too simple. Sometimes it remains half in shadow. Hayes prints the report, signs it, and files it into the digital archive. The printer hum fades. The office stills again. He steps outside into the early morning air. The sun is lifting slowly, dissolving the last edges of night. The light stretches across the parking lot, long shadows flattening until they become nothing more than thin, wavering lines. He looks toward the horizon, toward the places where old cases sleep in quiet earth and quiet memory. He knows this one is closed, technically. But closure isn't what he feels. Instead, he feels the weight of small truths. The ones found in dust, in paper, in faint marks that no one noticed the first time. The ones that turn justice into a process rather than a moment. The ones that remind him that some answers, though correct, never feel whole. He stands for a long time, hands in his pockets, the morning breeze brushing past. The world around him starts moving, cars, voices, footsteps, life returning to its steady rhythm. But crimes solved through logic and patience do not end with triumph. They end quietly, mechanically, thoughtfully. Hayes steps back inside, heading toward the archive department to submit the final documentation. As he walks, he carries not the noise of justice, but its echo, soft, restrained, resolved in process rather than emotion. Truth isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes it's buried in paper creases, in faint impressions, in the absence of detail. Sometimes it waits for decades until someone returns with patience rather than urgency. He pushes open the door to the records room. The case is solved. But something human remains, something that lingers in the spaces between facts, in the muted places where memory resists being fully quiet. And as Hayes sets the file down, the silence feels different now. Not empty, not heavy, just honest,